counsel, wisdom and understanding. We, thine unworthy servants, here gathered together in thy name, do most humbly beseech thee to send down thy heavenly wisdom from above, to direct and guide us in all our consultations. And grant that, we having thy fear always before our eyes, and laying aside all private interests, prejudices, and partial affections, the result of all our counsels may be to the glory of thy blessed name, the maintenance of true religion and justice, the safety, honor, and happiness of the Queen, the public weal, peace, and tranquility of the island, and the uniting and knitting together of all hearts, of all persons and estates within the same, in true Christian love and charity one towards another, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
This Honourable House now resumes its sittings. Call of the roll.
Mr. Whittle, Mr. Holness, Dr. Clark, Mr. Shaw, Dr. Chang, Dr. Chang, Mr. Samuda, Mr. Montague, Ms. Grange, Mr. Henry, Mr. Bartlett, Mr. Mackenzie, Mr. Chuck, Mr. Vaz, Mr. Daryl Vaz, Mr. Warmington, Mrs. Robinson, Mr. Hutchinson, Dr. Wheatley, Dr. Tufton, Mrs. Malahoo Ford, Mr. Spencer, Mrs. Williams, Mr. Green, Mr. R. Scott, Mr. Azan, Mr. Whittle, Dr. Bloomfield, Mr. Brown, Dr. Brownberg, Mr. Buchanan, Mr. Bunting, Dr. Campbell, Mr. Leslie Campbell, Dr. Campbell, not here, Mr. Clark, Mrs. Cuthbert Flynn, Ms. Daly, Mr. Daly, Mrs. Dalrymple Philibert, Dr. Dunn, Mr. Fagan, Dr. Ferguson, Mr. Golding, Dr. Guy, Ms. Hannah, Mr. Hales, Mrs. Holness, Mr. Hilton, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Kellier, Mr. Main, Dr. McNeil, Ms. Nita, Mr. Paulwell, Mr. Michael Phillips, Dr. Phillips, Mr. Pickersgill, Mr. Redmond, Mr. Robertson, Mr. Robinson, Mr. Stewart, Mr. Terry Long, Reverend Thwaites, Mr. Dwayne Vaz, Mr. Wright.
Yeah, but it's just being late.
Statements by ministers.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Technology, Science and Technology will make a statement. No, I'm just advising this Honourable House that the Minister of Science, Energy and Technology will make a very fulsome statement today.
Mr. Speaker, could the Minister
Members,
provide us with copies of the statement?
I think we should recognize some seat changes and some ministerial changes. Also, I'd wish to welcome the new leader of government business, Mr. Samuda. And as Speaker of the House, I wish to recognize the performance of Mr. Warmington in the period as leader of the House. I wish to recognize the new ministers and to welcome you here. At this time, the leader of government, the opposition business indicates he wanted to. Mr. Paulwell, you indicated you wanted to say something.
Mr. Speaker, let me, on behalf of the opposition, yes, I am, warmly welcome and greet the new leader of government business in the Parliament. Mr. Speaker, I won't say a lot today, but as you know, I have been saying that it does require somebody from the cabinet to take on this role, and I have no doubt that Minister Samuda will ensure that the relationship gets to being civilized, that there's a good working relationship, and that we'll be able to build greater trust in how we work across the aisle. So congratulations, Minister Samuda, on behalf of all of us. We wish you well.
Mr. Speaker, if I may, I'd just like to, on behalf of this entire House, extend my heartiest congratulations to the member from Southwest, St. Catherine, who acted with exemplary professionalism. He stood in the breach with honor and respect, and I want to thank him most sincerely. And he will continue to serve and assist us.
Members, Order, please. Members, I think that we should be very proud today to see democracy at its highest standard in our parliament. Democracy at its highest standard. Both sides, and I will endeavor to follow your footsteps. At this time, I wish to recognize Heart Trust, early childhood program persons, teachers who are here with us in the gallery. I wish to recognize the President of the Senate and a former senator. I wish you to welcome them for me, please. As I said earlier, members, we should be very proud of this parliament today. We are a happy bunch and we want to keep the standard up. Democracy at its highest performance. At this time,
Mr. Speaker, the Clancarty High School from Southeast St. Andrew is here, and I just would like you to acknowledge their presence.
I wish to welcome the students from the, as you have pointed out, and to say we at no time was overlooking them, but we welcome them, and I'm happy for you to bring them. "31 students plus their teachers, plus a teacher. Please give them another welcome for me, please. Dr. Wheatley, statement by Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you will recall that on November 14th of last year, I informed this House and by extension the country of Executive Order 13808 dated August 24, 2017 of the United States government, which imposed sanctions targeting the government of Venezuela and its state-owned entities. This created a level of uncertainty in the financial sector. And since then, the relationship between Petrojam Limited and PDVSA has come under intense scrutiny, both locally and internationally. Mr. Speaker, you will also recall that I reminded this House of the 2006 joint venture agreement between the PDV Caribe and the Petroleum Corporation of Jamaica, PCJ, the sole purpose of which was to upgrade the Petrojam refinery. More than 10 years after we entered into the joint venture with PDV Caribe, in an effort to promote definitive action, we also entered into a 2017 agreement for the upgrade of the Petrojam refinery with PDVSA. Mr. Speaker, this agreement expired in February of this year. Mr. Speaker, to date, neither the objective of the joint venture agreement nor the targets set out in the 2017 agreement have been met by the Venezuelan parties to the agreement. And this, Mr. Speaker, is despite the urgency placed on this matter by Jamaica. In my statement to Parliament last November, Mr. Speaker, I also indicated that the government of Jamaica, having assessed the issues as I have outlined, that we would take the necessary steps to safeguard the viability of our asset. last week, Thursday, March 22nd, we took one such step, Mr. Speaker, when I, along with the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, led a delegation to Venezuela. It should be noted, Mr. Speaker, that this meeting was the culmination of several exchanges of correspondence between myself and my counterpart minister with responsibility for petroleum in Venezuela. Mr. Speaker, the principal purpose of our visit was to formally make an offer to PDV Caribe for its 49% shareholding in Petrojam Limited. You will no doubt appreciate and understand, Mr. Speaker, that this is a commercially sensitive matter, the details of which cannot be disclosed publicly at this time. However, Mr. Speaker, we have been assured that the offer will be reviewed and considered by the Venezuelan government with a view to reverting to us shortly. Mr. Speaker, during our discussions, we recognized and expressed our gratitude to the Venezuelans for affording us the benefits of the Petrocaribe agreement. And we assure them, Mr. Speaker, that the repurchase of the 49% shares in Petrojam was to ensure that we are in control of our energy security going forward, Mr. Speaker, and more particularly, that we are able to undertake the necessary upgrade to our refinery. Resulting from the discussions, which were very amicable, Venezuela has pledged to appoint a team to visit Jamaica in the upcoming days with a view, Mr. Speaker, to pursuing more detailed discussions with Petrojam and PCJ's technical personnel. Mr. Speaker, we look forward to their arrival and the continuations of the negotiations. Mr. Speaker, we shall continue to provide this House and the nation with updates on our progress towards the government of Jamaica's 100% ownership of the Petrojam refinery. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Paulwell.
Mr. Speaker, the media has been hounding us for a response to the negotiations that the government has ensued with Venezuela, and we have been reticent because once the government of Jamaica is in negotiations, then we have to be careful not to prejudice those negotiations. But Mr. Speaker, you'll forgive me if I start where the minister ended by again saying how deeply the Jamaican people, our governments, ought to be to the government and people of Jamaica for the Petrocaribe agreement that was entered into in 2005. For Venezuela, the people and the government of Venezuela, for the tremendous act of generosity in 2005, the Petrocaribe agreement. And just to remind the House, because today we are seeing the price of oil south of $60. In fact, for a long period last year, it was between 40 and 50. But I remember in 2008, 2009, the then Minister of Finance will remind you that the price of crude went way over $100. In fact, went up to $140. And at that time, we would pay 50% of the price. And the remaining 50, we would put in a fund and treat it as a loan that would go for 20 odd years with 2 years moratorium. that effectively saved the Jamaican economy at 1% interest. That saved the Jamaican economy from ruin. You could imagine the value of our currency, what it would have been like had it not been for the Petro-Carib agreement. So I want to recall that. I also want to recall an act that took place that we have overlooked, because were it not for the debt buyback at half the price, Jamaica, that is now celebrating the tremendous success in the lowering of our debt to GDP. Had it not been for Venezuela, we wouldn't be there. We wouldn't have seen a shaving off of the primary surplus because of that tremendous act, again, by that government and people. So it is against that background that we are responding. And another minister might not be aware, but in 2008, and I'm aware that the Venezuelans were prepared. In fact, those days, with the price of oil at $150–140, they would invest in anything. And they were quite prepared, and I know that they were urging the government to proceed, but we couldn't, because at that time, the IMF in 2008 said, no, we will not allow you, because at that time we were contemplating going in it 49–51% in 2008, I remember that. And they were ready to go, but we couldn't go. And we told them to hold, because the main purpose of the agreement was to upgrade and expand the refinery. When they were ready, we weren't ready. Unfortunately, I know that we are ready, but they are going through their woes. So I want to put that in context. And just to make sure that in our zeal to pursue, we remember, we never forget the generosity of the government and people of Venezuela. Who's still with us? Mr. Minister, you spoke of two agreements. And this is a question I want to raise, because the agreement that was entered into with Venezuela for the refinery was entered into with PBCJ. But you entered last year into a new agreement, not with PBCJ, but with PDVSA. And I thought it was strange that you didn't use the same body, even though they are subsidiaries. But I thought it was a strange arrangement that you didn't use the same body to pursue. You have promised to keep us apprised of the negotiations, and we will hold you to it. There are some concerns that we have, but again, in the spirit that I have mentioned, as the government is in negotiation, we certainly wouldn't want to in any way prejudice those negotiations, because we know that without the expansion and upgrade, then that refinery really doesn't have a viable future. So we understand that. So if you could just explain, why did you use that vehicle to extend the agreement, and why didn't you use the original party, PBCJ?
Member, you will recall that the initial agreement that was signed in 2006, the joint venture agreement, critical component or condition of that agreement was the upgrading of the refinery. That was the commitment on the part of the Venezuelans. Yes, but the joint venture speaks to the Venezuelans, actually, and I'm sure you are familiar with the JV, not both parties, but a condition was that the Venezuelans would have upgraded the refinery. No, I just looked at it. Looked at it. It wasn't any joint venture upgrading. That was a condition of us selling them 49% of the refinery. And we can debate that, but I'm just telling you what it is. I'm telling you what it is, member. Now, in 2008, you mentioned that the Venezuelans were ready to participate in a refinery upgrade. At that time, they indicated to us a certain level of willingness. But you'll recall that there was a matter initially about the 2%, transfer of 2%. Yes, so I refreshed myself before coming to this the house, right? But I think because you have been out for so long now, your memory is a bit clouded. No, remember, the reality is that we are at a point now where last year, February, we signed a second agreement, or an agreement that speaks to the going forward with the refinery upgrade. So that agreement was signed by between PCJ and PDVSA because you will appreciate that the situation in Venezuela has changed significantly, where PDVSA is actually dealing with all things petroleum. And so that agreement was signed, witnessed by President Maduro and myself and the then Minister of Energy, and was signed by our representative from PCJ and their representative from PDVSA. So that second agreement had a number of timelines as relates to planning and going through the technical specs with the selected EPC contractor. The Venezuelans did not participate despite us keeping them abreast. They did not actively participate in the whole process, and as such, the agreement expired on February 14th. Appreciating the critical nature of the upgrade of the refinery to our own energy security, we approached them, and of course, bearing in mind also the impacts of the executive order that was issued by the U.S. government on our operations. And I had informed the House late last year, as to the severity of the impacts of the executive order on our operations, and for us to actively do business, whether to pay for goods and services or to even collect funds after we have sold products to a number of entities. Once they are used in a U.S. correspondence bank, it becomes difficult for us to receive or send funds. And we were subjected to additional due diligence as relates to being able to transact business. And so we wrote to them. We were very proactive in that we indicated to our counterparts in Venezuela that we would wish to purchase their stake in the refinery. They changed their minister, and we wrote back again. And last week, we had a discussion, and we made a formal offer to them. And I must add, Minister, that at all times we have expressed on behalf of the government and the people of Jamaica our appreciation for the level of support that we have gotten from them over the years. So that is no secret. We really appreciate the support that we have gotten from Venezuela. But one must remember that our own energy security as a nation is at stake. And as such, we are not abandoning PetroCaribe. What we are saying is that for our own energy security, for us to be able to, provide in a timely manner products to our citizens and be able to do business, that we have to take a strategic decision for the refinery upgrade, not only as a result of the impact of the executive order, but also for the refinery to be able to comply with IMO standards, which will come into effect in January 2020. The refinery upgrade is critical for the survival of the refinery and for us able to provide products to our citizens?
Two questions, and I didn't want to press too much on the issue of the role of Venezuela in the expansion and upgrade of the refinery, because you know that the government share is 51% and Venezuela is 49%. So the notion that you have that Venezuela would have funded, it can't be seen in isolation. The government of Jamaica would have to Right. So even if Venezuela were to provide the funds, it would have to be some debt and some equity, because the government of Jamaica would be responsible, will have 51% in the finished product. Yes, no, but I know as a fact that in 2008 the government of Jamaica could not pursue it because of the restriction that you have there. So if we can agree on that, then probably I could ask you another question which was raised during the Standing Finance Committee in relation to the operations of Petrojam, because I'd asked the question if you're witnessing major staff deficit, a lot of your experienced staffers leaving for whatever reason, hence the problem that we're having with asphalt. I gather that we had substandard asphalt in the marketplace. I gather that we also had a shortage of asphalt, and it is my understanding that you are losing qualified staff there for a number of reasons, and you were to answer.
Member, I'm very pleased that you asked that question, because I must admit that you are misinformed as relates to attrition at the refinery. Because, in fact, when you asked the question, I went back and I did some checks as relates to the point you raised about staff leaving the refinery. Now, I am glad also that you raised the matter of the shortage of asphalt. In fact, no substandard asphalt reached the market. So let us get that straight. It was because of the fact that at the time they were producing asphalt, it did not actually meet the standard. And it goes back to the state of the refinery. The refinery is inefficient, and it is because of it is an outdated refinery, a refinery that is in need of urgent upgrade. And that is why it is critical for us to move ahead with the upgrade, especially the first phase, the VDU, which is the phase that will allow us to be able to produce high quality, large amounts, or large quantities of asphalt. And it is because of the state of the refinery, that is why we were getting off spec. But I must add that the technical team at the refinery, and based on their experience and with the assistance of some overseas consultants, we are producing more than enough asphalt to meet the market demand.
Mr. Hilton, you have a question?
Mr. Speaker, may I just ask the Minister, initially, Petro-Caribbean was about the supply, to secure energy supplies. Initially, the Petro-Caribbean arrangement was about the security of supplies to Jamaica. With this decision now and the offer to Venezuela about the upgrade, is there, what if any implication there may be for the supply arrangement of crude?
Member, we have not gotten any supply of crude from Venezuela since May of last year. The supplies, it has gone down. The volume of crude that we have been getting from Venezuela is relatively negligible. Over the last 2 years, it has decreased significantly. And so it is safe to say we have not gotten any. The last shipment was a shipment in May, just one shipment. So in terms of supply, it has dwindled down to nothing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Minister, I think we're all aware, well, certainly if you've been following world news, that the United States has a deliberate approach recently to perhaps intrude on other countries. Can you hear me? You can hear me? It's not me, it's you. He can't hear you because you were talking. I'll soon talk to you, man. Congrats. The United States has had a deliberate policy recently in perhaps putting some of their own U.S. domestic laws in other countries. While I don't wish to get too much into that, the last time you were here, there was a discussion around sanctions about companies in Venezuela that trade. I have a couple questions, but the first one, was this a direct request by the United States to buy back the 49% so that you don't risk being sanctioned by them? That's my first question.
Member, we did not receive any requests from the United States as relates to the buyback. It was a strategic, or it's a strategic decision on the part of the government to secure Jamaica's energy security.
Can you say if, without giving too many details, as you said before, if no progress is made on this issue, will this affect our relationship and trade with the United States?
Member, I don't think I'm in a position, I know I'm not in a position to determine or speak on behalf of the government of the United States of America. What I can tell you, government, we are making every effort to, and as such, we have taken a strategic approach, taking into consideration all the factors, especially as relates to the state of the refinery, the urgent need for the refinery to be upgraded, to be compliant with international standards that's going to come into effect in 2020. And the member from East Kingston and Port Royal made mention of the asphalt. And I must use this opportunity to inform the House that the first phase of that of the refinery upgrade is the VDU project. And what that will do is to allow us not only to supply asphalt for local use, but also for export within the region. And in fact, the International Marine Organization, they have stipulated that the standard of fuel for bunkering will change in 2020. And for us to be able to supply that market, and you know, we can all appreciate the number of cruise ships and other ships that uses our ports, that it is essential for us to be able to supply fuel.
Let me perhaps ask a question another way, because I realize your reticence to answer directly. Even if the negotiation does go through, will the United States allow you to pay for it, since they have problems with us doing business with companies in Venezuela?
Member, I believe that we'll be able to develop a mechanism that will facilitate whether direct payment or through some other mechanism.
Final question is about the financing of the negotiation. The financing of the negotiation and the payment of the negotiation. Is the government in a position to pay for this?
It is there. Member, I'm sure that you have taken the time out to scrutinize the budget that we passed recently, and would have seen a special allocation there for us to pay for the. You can check the.
No,
we are still in negotiation. Member, we are still in negotiation. So, but you'll recall that there is an allocation in the budget. It is there, it is there, it is there. It is there, it is there. In fact, you recall, remember that I indicated during the Standing Finance Committee, the question was asked. But the provision is there. The provision is there.
I like your tie, by the way. Very nice. My final question to you is simply, I mean, I realize, and certainly we all realize, your administration's inability to lead the region in a consensus on Venezuela. Can you tell me, essentially, what will be your position going forward if you are seeking support from some of our allies in the region?
You know, member, I can appreciate where you're coming from, being the spokesperson on foreign affairs, but I believe that that question would be more appropriately answered by the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade.
Announcements. Order, please.
Sam. No, Sam, no.
Laid on the table of the House today are the following. The Public Procurement Regulations 2018, Public Procurement Regulations Resolution 2018 under the Procurement Act. The Public Procurement Reconsideration and Review Regulations 2018 and the Public Procurement Reconsideration and Review Regulation Resolution 2018 under the Procurement Act.
Minister Chuck, you're making some gesture. Would you want to address me?
Statement by ministers. Can we have a recommittal of statement by ministers?
Minister, it is customary to advise the leader of government business and not to request it from your seat. If you are ready to make your statement, Minister, I will allow it on this occasion, but it must not become habitual. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I ask for a committal statement.
Those in favor? Those against? As of it. Minister Chuck, you have a statement?
This Mr.
Please
Speaker,
indicate and proceed.
I'll have to give you a corrected version. So I'll give it to you. If you don't mind, it's more oral than written. Because I had promised you. Huh? They're in the com.
You come like Nicodemus.
There. If not, we can put it off.
Mr. Speaker, I humbly request that this matter be put off for another sitting of the House.
Bills brought from the Senate.
The following is a message from the President of the Senate to the Honourable House of Representatives. I have the honour to advise the Honourable House of Representatives that on the 23rd day of March 2018, a bill entitled An Act to Apply a Sum out of the Consolidated Fund to the service of the year ending on the 31st day of March 2019 and to appropriate the sums granted in this session of Parliament was passed in the Senate without amendment. Signed Thomas Tavares Finson, QC, CD, JP.
Order, please. Petitions, papers, reports, from committees? Notices of motions given orally. Mr. Clerk, go ahead.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move the following two motions. The first of which is the Public Procurement Act, the Public Procurement Reconsideration and Review Regulations Resolution 2018. Whereas by virtue of Section 61 of the Public Procurement Act, hereinafter referred to as the Act, the Minister may make such regulations as he thinks fit to give full effect to the provisions of the Act, and without prejudice to the foregoing, regulations may prescribe provisions in relation to matters specified in paragraphs A to J of Section 60, subsection 1. And whereas on the 26th day of March 2018, the Minister made the Public Procurement Reconsideration and Review Regulations 2018, and whereas it is provided by Section 60, subsection 2 of the Act that regulations made under paragraphs A, C, E, F, and G of Section 60, subsection 1 of the Act shall be subject to affirmative resolution. Now, therefore, be it resolved by this Honourable House as follows. 1. This resolution may be cited as a Public Procurement Reconsideration and Review Regulations Resolution 2018. 2. The Public Procurement Reconsideration and Review Regulations 2018, which were laid on the table of the House on the 27th day of March 2018, are hereby affirmed. And the second one is the Public Procurement Act, the Public Procurement Regulations Resolution 2018. Whereas by Section 60, subsection 1 of the Public Procurement Act, hereinafter referred to as the Act, the Minister may make such regulations as he thinks fit to give full effect to the provisions of the Act, and without prejudice to the foregoing, regulations may prescribe provisions in relation to matters specified in paragraphs A to J of Section 60, subsection 1. And whereas on the 26th day of March 2018, the Minister made the Public Procurement Regulations 2018, and whereas it is provided by Section 60, subsection 2 of the Act, that regulations made under paragraphs A, C, E, F, and G of Section 60, subsection 1 of the Act shall be subject to affirmative resolution. Now, therefore, be it resolved by this Honourable House as follows. 1. The resolution may be cited as the Public Procurement Regulations Resolution 2018. The Public Procurement Regulations 2018, which were laid on the table of the House on the 27th day of March 2018, are hereby affirmed. Mr. Speaker, I further beg to give notice that at a later stage today, I will move for suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take these motions. No.
Mr. Speaker, we wish to request a recommittal of statements by ministers, as at the time the Prime Minister was ready, certain documentation wasn't available. So I now ask for the recommittal of statements by ministers. The Prime Minister would like to make a statement.
Those in favour? Those against? As a Prime Minister.
Public emergency has been declared in the St. Catherine North Police Division. The enhanced security measures took effect on Sunday, the 18th of March, 2008. Following the proclamation by His Excellency, the Governor General, for a period not exceeding 14 days. You now have the statement. On the request of the security forces, the St. Catherine North Police Division was selected for a state of public emergency in response to increasing criminal activity, including inter-gang conflicts and murders. This deliberate and strategic measure is therefore a necessary requirement at this time for upholding and preserving the rule of law and maintaining public order. Police statistics have shown that the St. Catherine North Division has recorded the highest number of homicides this year, with 48 persons being murdered between the 1st of January to the 18th of January. 136 persons were murdered in that division last year. Mr. Speaker, the state of public emergency gives the security forces extraordinary powers to protect the citizens through a suite of operations to bring the high levels of violence under control. Mr. Speaker, let me emphasize again that with extraordinary powers comes extraordinary responsibilities. The enhanced security measures in the St. Catherine North Police Division have so far yielded unquestionable results, and the impact, Mr. Speaker, cannot be overstated. There has been no report of murders in that space, and I knock on wood for that. There has been no report of serious crimes, and there has been no report of abuse by the security forces. As you are aware, an extension of the period must be approved by both houses of Parliament by resolution supported by a 2/3 majority of all the members of each house. The extension can allow for the continuation of the state of public emergency for a period not exceeding 3 months. Mr. Speaker, the security forces must be given the latitude to maintain and continue their actions. They must disrupt and degrade the capacity of these criminal gangs and provide a safe environment for the residents, business owners, and persons going about their legitimate business. There will be some inconvenience within the designated area, and we are, however, asking for the continued understanding and cooperation of all Jamaicans, particularly those most affected. Mr. Speaker, it is within this context that I am bringing the Emergency Powers number 2 Continuation Resolution 2018 to this Honourable House to have the state of public emergency for the St. Catherine North Police Division remain in force until the 3rd of July 2018. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Jackson.
Mr. Speaker, before I commence my remarks in response to the Prime Minister, even in his absence, I want to recognize the appointment of the new Minister of National Security, the member from Northwest St. James. And as I've said to him in our private exchange, he will have my full support in his execution of his responsibility. Mr. Speaker, on the matter before us, the request for the extension of the state of emergency, it is on record that the opposition has no objection to the declaration of the state of emergency in the St. Catherine North Police Division. Mr. Speaker, the state of emergency is the extreme provision under the Constitution of Jamaica. It's an extreme provision because it provides for the denial of some of our fundamental rights and freedoms, and therefore it's not something that can be used willy-nilly. It's something that is designed by the framers of our Constitution to be used in extreme circumstances. And indeed, the high levels of murder over recent times represent an extreme situation. But, Mr. Speaker, we did not arrive there overnight. It was allowed to fester, and we are where we are. While we have no objection to the state of emergency, and we will not object to the request for the extension that is before us, because it's a temporary measure, Mr. Speaker, by design and by provision in the Constitution, the urgent question on every Jamaican's mind, what happens after? Because the country does not want to revert to those high levels of murder throughout the country. Indeed, as the Prime Minister has indicated, there has been a significant reduction in that geographic space of North St. Catherine since the declaration of the state of emergency, as is the case in St. James, where we have a similar situation. Like for St. James, it is for St. Catherine and for other areas in the country where we have high levels of murder and shootings. We have high levels of murders in areas of Clarendon. We have high levels of murders in other sections of the Kingston metro area, South St. Andrew, Central St. Andrew. There are high levels over last year and the preceding year. The state of emergency, then, therefore, cannot be seen as the response for sustainable murder reduction and crime control. So, Mr. Prime Minister, through you, Mr. Speaker, Prime Minister, while the opposition offers no objection, and it is a fact that we expect the murders to go down with the presence of the security forces, the JDF and the JCF, in those specified spaces. We are not surprised of the results. We welcome the results, but it is a temporary measure, as we all know. And it is what happens thereafter that is the question of the moment. And we welcome the government indicating to us what are those steps that will be taken so that the restriction of rights and freedoms does not become a permanent feature throughout the length and breadth of Jamaica for some indefinite period as a means of dealing with the scourge of high murders.
Dr. Phillips.
Mr. Speaker, as has been indicated, we certainly share the plight and the concerns of the citizens across Jamaica who are being affected by the extraordinary levels of crime and violence in the country. Recognize also the particular circumstance the particular circumstance of the citizens in St. Catherine North, which in recent times has been the scene of particularly gruesome murders, robberies, and rapes. I think we need to emphasize, Mr. Speaker, that the declaration of a state of emergency can't be seen as an anti-crime policy measure. Indeed, it is a power which, as has been said, that is to be used sparingly and is to be used as a last resort. Contrary to it being a policy measure which we can resort to regularly, it really is in circumstances like this, where it is a response not to natural disaster of some sort, it is really an indication of the failure of policy to deal with the situation of repeated criminal violence. But we all accept that we are now facing a severe situation, and thus that has to be responded to. But we want to emphasize, Mr. Speaker, that this repeated resort to states of emergency ought not to be allowed to continue in perpetuity. Also, in the areas where states of emergency have been declared, we also would like to get some indication, not of a date when it will come to an end, but what are the indicators and factors that will inform any decision to bring a state of emergency to an end. This is necessary because, in fact, we should not ignore the situation where that is implied by the declaration of states of emergency, even though there has been no excessive police behavior or military behavior reported. It is an infringement on the rights of citizens, and that we need to, in this parliament, guard against such infringements. You know, I sought to get the numbers in relation to both St. James and St. Catherine North, as far as the number of persons charged is concerned and the number of people detained is concerned. I am informed that up to March 22nd, there had been approximately 1,230 persons detained in St. James. Of that number, 142 have been charged. Others have been released, but the fact of their release is important, but the fact of their detention is also important, and some of them were detained for periods of time which we would consider tolerable as long as it did not apply to us individually. But were we the persons that were detained, or were there family members of ours or others, we might consider these things an undue infringement on the rights of the citizen. And so while in the extreme circumstance of the excessive degree of criminal activity in St. James. We have all tolerated this. We should not become inured or insensitive to the fact that these detentions were an infringement of the constitutional rights of citizens and rights that are otherwise guaranteed by the Constitution of Jamaica. In St. Catherine, over the past week, 719 persons were detained, 29 have been charged. So there is a general pattern whereby you have thousands, in the case of St. James, of persons being detained, arrested, scooped up, but the charges are applied to relatively few.
Would the member yield? Mr. Speaker, I wish to remind the members that this is a response to a statement by ministers, and the opposition spokesman has 5 minutes. The present speaker, the leader of the opposition, does not fall into that category. So I ask that he wrap up and wait until the resolution is put.
Mr. Speaker, if you will indulge me.
Let me just reply to the member, please. Members. Mr. Samudo, you're correct. However, I had allowed Mr. Jackson to make a short statement. And because I did not advise the leader of the opposition, I am for equitability, as he has asked for. I'm going to allow him to finish, but to advise that when we get to public business, those who have spoken already will not be permitted to speak again. So I'm going to ask Mr. Phillips to finish.
Mr. Speaker.
And then we will proceed. And when we come back to public business, the matter will be open for debate.
Your understanding is exactly mine. I had suggested to the Most Honourable Prime Minister that we in fact debate the matter when this came, so that it is not my intention to, in fact, that would have been a better way of proceeding, because then we could have had the debate. It is not my intention to participate in the debate further, and as I think was a tacit understanding between the Prime Minister and this side, that we would say what we have to say and then we take the motion. So I thank you.
The Prime Minister cannot allow you to do that.
I know, Mr. Speaker.
Standing orders, I've already advised the leader of opposition.
Mr. Speaker.
I'm going to allow you to finish.
I am much obliged.
There will be no further debate until the matter goes on the public business.
And I'm certain you're hearing me, Mr. Speaker. Because I'm saying that that is what we propose to do, and I think your wisdom is evident, even if you don't agree.
So, Mr. Phillips, let's go ahead and finish your presentation.
His wisdom is evident, yours is not. Mr. Speaker.
Finish your presentation, and then we move on to public business.
Mr. Speaker, the point simply is that what we would want, Prime Minister, is a clear statement before we move on to further extensions, which I believe are to come in May in relation to St. James, as to one, what are the factors that will bring about a cessation of the powers of the state of emergency. Two, is an effective national crime plan which the Prime Minister in his contribution to the budget debate said would be forthcoming, and some indication as to the means whereby the country will get to a point where we can increase the conviction rate as far as murders are concerned. Because I think evidence all over the world shows that the surest way to contain crime is to ensure that those who commit murders and other crimes will be detected, apprehended, brought before the courts, and indeed pay the penalty if they are guilty. That's what we need. We need to have some clear indicators of how we are going to approach that point. I would also think it would be appropriate, Mr. Speaker, if we could get brought before the House some clearer report as to progress made in dismantling the organized criminal enterprises that exist in these areas, which it has been said are the main drivers of this criminal violence. What are more arrests and charges to be forthcoming? And what is going to be the medium-term activity? I think we also need to kind of have a sense of what other areas are likely to be affected. I was struck, again, having asked for the information, that the sharpest rate of increase in murder to date is not St. Catherine North, but indeed St. Andrew Southern, where there's been an over 300% increase in the rates of murder in that police division. And again, we need to have some indication of what is likely to happen. But finally, Mr. Speaker, we're talking about the whole police division, not just the Denham town. It affects many constituencies. The question of the regulations, which we had raised before. First, in the definition of competent authority, which is clear as it is, but it seems to suggest that the competent authority is not a composite body as such. It is in fact any one of these officials can, for the purposes of the regulations, act as the competent authority, whether together or separately. Without belaboring the point, we would prefer if it was a composite entity, because there are significant powers assigned to the competent authority here. And included in the competent authority is the minister with responsibility for national security in this matter. The competent authority has the power to set up cordons, block roads, etc. But I want particularly to advert to the powers given specifically to the minister in section 32 and 33, the power of confinement to a place of residence, and 33, which has the power to detain and, in fact, to to impose other restrictions in 33 subsection 4, other restrictions on personal movement. We would feel more comfortable if it were stated plainly that the power of the minister exercisable under these clauses is to be exercised upon the advice of the competent authority. Not that we have any distrust of the minister. In fact, from day to day, we might not know who the minister is. But we don't think it is a power in our circumstances. No, it's a matter of principle. Another way, I don't know in the drafting, another way might be to say, another way might be to include a clause at the end which says simply all powers exercisable by the minister under these clauses are to be construed as being exercised on the advice of the competent, the composite body, or of the chiefs of the security forces, or the National Security Council, or some entity. But we think, as it stands here, these tremendous powers in law provided for ought to be made clear that they are exercisable not by an individual, but in pursuit of the national security objectives. But with those comments, Mr. Speaker, as I said again, we would in this instance support the extension of the state of emergency for the period set out in the order in St. Catherine North. Thank you.
Prime Minister. Speaker.
Members, let me repeat.
Question, yes.
A statement by a minister requires the opposition spokesman to make a comment, and 3 questions thereto. However, the importance of this statement, it will go to public business in a few minutes. All members of the House will be permitted to speak on the matter. The leader of the opposition, by virtue of his position, take advantage, and I allowed him. I'm not going to allow any further speech on this motion until we get to the topic under public business. The member from Central St. Mary requested to ask a question, and that will be the last one until we get to the topic.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister. Prime Minister. The regulations here I'm seeing under interpretation, a senior authorized person. Senior authorized person means any, and let's look at B. Commissioned officer in the Jamaica Defense Force or in any of the armed forces of any specified country. Is it the intention of the government to, I'm asking, because if you go further on in the regulations, there are significant powers that are given to the senior authorized person. So I would like to know, the Parliament would like to know, and we on this side would like to know if it's the intention, and the public, if it's the intention of the government to have any armed forces of any specified country given the powers of a senior authorized person under this regulation.
Prime Minister, I'm going to ask the leader of government business to advise me on this matter. If you could, if it suits the House, I would prefer the Prime Minister to hold all the questions until we get to the topic where he do You
No,
want,
Mr.
you want
Speaker,
to
the
do
Prime
some?
Minister is prepared and ready
Prime
to
Minister,
answer
you
all
want to answer at this
questions
stage?
at this time. We'd like to complete this before having to go to public business and discuss it and debate it.
No, that cannot be.
That can't. The
Prime Minister is going to answer the question, and then we're going to debate the matter in public business.
Mr. Speaker, the intention is to ensure that all the issues surrounding the declaration and extension of a state of public emergency is thoroughly ventilated within the House. So we, on this side, within the scheme of the standing orders, welcome all questions. Let me start with the member from St. Mary regarding the powers which seem to extend to foreign personnel. These are fairly standard regulations. You could almost call them pro forma, which we use from time to time. They are not the special crafting of this government. And if you examine previous states of emergencies, you would probably find that that provision is there. Just in case, for example, a state of emergency is declared for a weather event, and you may need to invite foreign powers here to assist, then they are covered. So it is just a general provision. Having said that, it could very well be excluded. It could very well be excluded from this one. But there is absolutely no intention to give any authority to any foreign power. And I just want to put your mind at ease, because such a such a question could easily be construed as mischievous. Of course, well, I hope not, but it could easily be. But I want to put your mind at ease, as I have explained, that it is a standard clause in these kinds of regulations. Secondly, the issue raised by the Leader of the Opposition regarding the composition of competent authority. I am going to ask the Business Department to examine the concern that you raised. Just my initial review would suggest that there is no harm done in the way in which this is constructed, because all the offices mentioned in the competent authority have their own powers in law, which only they could exercise. So in effect, they are each acting on the advice of, once they are in this competent body. So for example, the Governor General's office is considered to be part of the competent authority. Only the Governor General can proclaim. So being a part of the competent body and having that power of proclamation, he is, by virtue of exercising the power of proclamation within the competent authority, obviously he's exercising it on the advice of the other offices within that competent authority. So whilst I am not seeing the need for a further clarification, but I am not the legal mind, and I think there might very well be merit in what you have proposed, so I've asked the AG's department to note it and to advise. Now, just for correct procedure, Mr. Speaker, the declaration of the state of emergency with the Governor General's proclamation, the House is at this time acknowledging that there is a state of emergency. State of emergency still exists under the proclamation, the regulations that are being tabled are based upon the fact that it is the Governor General's proclamation. We are not going to debate it. It should not be. For transparency. At that time, we can tear it apart, make the changes that we want. So I'm signaling now to the AG's department to give consideration to the suggestions made here by the Leader of the Opposition, so that when we come back for the extension, if there is merit, then we will proceed to amend. For the first 14 days, yes. Yes, the AG is noted. Yes.
Question?
Oh, you wanted to ask another question? I wasn't finished, but go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead. And then I'll...
Prime Minister, I want to know if you are prepared, the government is prepared to amend confinement to place of residence. And I think the Leader of the Opposition raised it. And it, just reading through it, I think for good order, something needs to be affixed further to this clause. The minister, if satisfied that it is necessary so to do in order to prevent any person from acting in any manner, might decide that the person be put on house arrest. I mean, that is what it is saying, house arrest. I don't think the Minister of National Security should have that power in today's Jamaica outside of, on the advice of somebody else or a body. I want to know if you are prepared to, and I invite members to read this carefully. In the case of a person who has no fixed address, the Minister of National Security will determine where that person goes. So you can send him to Red Fence or send him wherever. I'm just saying in today's Jamaica, no minister. No, we have been there. We have all been there. So just, this is serious business. This is serious business. Are you prepared to consider amending this clause that the minister makes this order on the advice of the security forces or on the advice of the competent authority as previously raised by the opposition leader?
The intention, member, of these actions is not to give ministers arbitrary power. So we will take your suggestion and review it so that that action could be brought under the competent authority. We'll look at it. I wanted, however, to respond to some of the pertinent issues raised by the Leader of the Opposition. I think we can all agree, Mr. Speaker, that the calling of states of public emergency is not a crime plan. And we have never proposed it to be the entirety of a crime plan. It is indeed a last resort, Mr. Speaker. And you would recall that when we did the first state of emergency in St. James, people were saying, why did you wait so long? The truth is that you have to exhaust all the tools in the toolbox of national security before you consider using these extraordinary powers. So we did not take it lightly, and I want to assure Jamaica, assure the Parliament, that we have put in place a system to guide us in determining when there is a need to call a state of emergency. Obviously, we would be looking, Mr. Speaker, on, for example, the absolute number of murders committed in an area, whether or not that is escalating, violence surrounding it, and we would have to get a better understanding as to whether or not the people in that space feel unsafe and that public order is threatened. I think in all our actions, no one could question that the areas that have been placed under a state of emergency deserve to be so declared, because there is an escalation in murder and violence, there is a breakdown in public order, and the people who are in that space feel insecure. So the issue of whether or not we have called the state of emergency on a genuine basis, I think that cannot be questioned. But I hear the leader of the opposition to be saying that there are other communities, you mentioned St. Andrew South, that we see signs of, the police division, forgive me. Yes, the police division, where crime, particularly murders, are escalating. But then you have to look at the absolute number. You mentioned a 310% increase. The absolute number has not increased relative to if you were to compare it to other areas. But, Mr. Speaker, I wish to assure Jamaica that the government is looking at every community in Jamaica and putting them on a matrix. And from that kind of analysis, if we see where there is an escalation in murders, violence, or other activities that threaten public order, we will respond. The response may not be a state of emergency, but there will be a response. Let me say, Mr. Speaker, that we have a crime plan. The crime plan is working. There is a call for us to put out in the public domain a document, a presentation, something that the public can say, yes, hold on, this is a crime plan. And I'm agreeing with that position, as I did in the budget debate, that we will very shortly come to the public with that position. As I said in the public debate, there is one element that we have not yet settled. The crime plan must include in it something to say that this Parliament agrees on a set of actions, that we are carving out national security as an area where there is bipartisan support for policy. Last week, Mr. Speaker, we made an important step in that regard. We had, attending the National Security Council meeting, the opposition spokesperson on national security. We have outlined some of the plans. We're going to go through them. There are some steps to be done, which I won't say what those are to come to a final and firm position as to the members' participation. But as soon as that is done and we go through and itemize the various plans and programs, then we can come to the public. It makes no sense, Mr. Speaker, for us to put out a crime plan and then have it being torpedoed. We don't want that. We are a stronger front against crime when we are unified as a country. In the same way in which we, as a Parliament, came together to put together the Education Transformation Task Force, I am proposing, Mr. Speaker, that we will have to do similarly. And I am hopeful that the opposition will partner with the government in putting together this national plan to secure Jamaica. Mr. Speaker, it is not my intention to limit the opposition's right to oppose. But having not been too long from that side, and I have no intention of going back. What I have learned, Mr. Speaker, is that you don't always win by opposing. And in fact, the politics has changed so much that you are more likely to win by being constructive and supportive. So I think that the dynamics of our politics gives the opportunity for a national front against crime, where no one loses any political votes, but we all stand to gain from the success. Mr. Speaker, we are seeing the early signs of success. I am not here claiming it, because the opposition would have equal claim to say we supported, we voted in favor of. But that's what I'm saying. There is no, and I have not come here to in any way gloat or claim any benefit or get a political one-upmanship. It is evident that if the criminals see that there is a separation in the Houses of Parliament on crime strategy, they will wait us out. What must come out of this House is that JLP and PNP, government and opposition, are at one. That let us once and for all deal with this crime situation. Mr. Speaker, it is not beyond us to do it. It is not beyond us. I want to address another issue raised by the leader of the opposition. The Constitution of our country makes provision for the use of force. And it gives laws that guide the use of force. Unfortunately, our history has been that when the state uses force, the force is sometimes bordering on violence, it is disproportionate and arbitrary. Violence abusive. What we have to do now, as the people leading the country, is to ensure that when we give extraordinary powers, that is the use of force, that it is not discriminate, it's not arbitrary, it's not violent, but it is used in a targeted, reasonable way. And that is what we have done, Mr. Speaker. Our security forces, so far, so good. I believe at that point is coming home to them that though you are empowered to use force, it is not arbitrary or beyond review. And I think, Mr. Speaker, that yes, we must always be careful about the use of the extraordinary powers, but I think we must have some faith in ourselves that we are able to use the powers given by the Constitution in the appropriate way. Agreed, and that's why I'm not taking a belligerent approach, that let's find the right balance to ensure that we can use the powers given to us in an appropriate way. And I think we are striking that right balance. We just need to proceed on the pathway. Mr. Speaker, we don't want, and I'm joining the leader of the opposition now in this point, we don't want the state of emergency to become a an overused tool. As you can see, it gives wide powers, as the member from St. Mary, his question would have demonstrated. I think that we can find a more clinical approach that would set out powers, we could call it enhanced powers, or some name we can find for it, that would allow us to rapidly deploy them without having to go through the procedures that we have to now do. It would give us a significant advantage. And better than that, Mr. Speaker, the use of the term state of emergency has international connotations which are negative. It impacts our tourism, it impacts the brand Jamaica. And so we don't want to be using this term. So we do plan, as part of the crime plan, to come back to Parliament to have a discussion around legislation that will give not emergency powers, but some intermediate powers that we would need to bring the crime problem under control. My last statement, Leader of the Opposition. If you analyze criminal activity anywhere, you would recognize crime occurs where there is opportunity, capability and capacity, intent, and propensity. The strategies we have employed so far have addressed opportunity, controlling the space, and capabilities, reducing their ability to use firearms, weapons, and commit crimes. To have a real impact, we now need to deal with the propensity and the intention. Those don't only lie with the police. They are social issues, they are justice issues, and yes, they are policing issues. And so we have to very soon shift the debate towards strategies to deal with why are we so violent? Why are we resolving crimes using murder and shooting, right? So we have to move the conversation to that. Yes, but then there's the other issue of we deal with the propensity, but then the criminal mind. That is now something that we have to pay attention to. No, but Mr. Speaker, I think that the public has been so absorbed in looking at the outer symptom of crime, but have not yet come to the understanding that their own behavior supports the dons, who they are the ones who really have the intelligence and the intent to direct crime. But yet we support them as community leaders, as godfathers. But they are the ones with the criminal intent, and we as parliamentarians must help our constituents make the link that these men who stand up in communities and say they're sending some children to school and you go to them for justice and they operate a parallel state, that they are the ones who also recruit your sons and daughters into gangs. That they are the ones who organize the criminal enterprise, gather the young men around them, and then send them to the shopkeeper to say, I am going to protect you from me, pay me. Extortion. Or go to the elderly lady who lives on a street and say, I'm going to rent your house and take the money. Or worse, come to you and say, I like your daughter, send her to me tonight. And we remain quiet. Well, I could give you. No. Member, I would be... I have to be... I have a... But I'm not going to give so much information because as leader of the opposition, we have an opportunity now. If we work together, I think we can make a break. You would have seen in the last few months where targeted operations have infiltrated and degraded the capacity of at least 2 gangs. We have over 200 gangs. So, yes, but you have to go after the big ones and the criminal, those that have the criminal intent. So, Mr. Speaker, I recommend to the House that we seek to build a partnership on crime, that we have started that process, that we will be very cooperative on this side with suggestions made by the opposition to ensure that we strike the right balance. I feel, Mr. Speaker, that we are onto a good thing and that Jamaica at the end will win. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Members, as I said, this matter will return to the debate in a few minutes. We now have questions and answers to questions. Do you have something you want to say?
Mr. Speaker, I wish to ask that there's a recommittal of notices of motion given orally, and announcements as well.
Announcements. Those in favor? Those against? Announcements. The ayes have it.
Also laid on the table of the House today is the Emergency Powers No. 2 Regulations 2018 and the Emergency Powers No. 2 Continuation Resolution 2018 under the Emergency Powers Act.
Mr. Speaker, notices of motion, a recommittal of notice of motion given orally.
Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. Go ahead, Dave.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice. Well, before I do, Mr. Speaker, just so that the public following would understand that what we did earlier was to make a statement and that questions were asked of the statement that I made regarding the proclamation of the state of emergency. And we also spoke to the tabling of the Emergency Powers Act, the regulations rather, which were tabled and are now in effect. And now I have to read the resolution into the record, which I will now do, and then when we go to public business, we will vote on the resolution. So I'm going to read into the record now at motions given orally. Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move the following motion. Whereas by virtue of Section 21 and 2B of the Constitution of Jamaica, the Governor-General may make a proclamation declaring that a state of public emergency exists if satisfied that action has been taken or is immediately threatened by any person or body or persons of such a nature and on so extensive a scale as to be likely to endanger the public safety. And whereas the Governor-General was satisfied that a state of public emergency existed as a result of the aforementioned circumstances, and whereas on the 18th day of March 2018, the Governor-General by proclamation declared that a state of public emergency exists in the areas of the parish of St. Catherine specified in the schedule to the proclamation, and further declared that the said proclamation shall, unless previously revoked, remain in force for 14 days or such longer period not exceeding 3 months, as both Houses of Parliament may determine by a resolution supported by a 2/3 majority of all the members of each House. And whereas it is provided by Section 23 of the Constitution of Jamaica that a proclamation made by the Governor-General for the purposes of and in accordance with that section shall, unless previously revoked, remain in force for 14 days or such longer period, not exceeding 3 months, as both houses may determine by a resolution supported by a 2/3 majority of all the members of each house. And whereas it is desirable that the state of public emergency declared as aforementioned should remain in force for 3 months until the 3rd day of July 2018, now therefore be it resolved by this Honourable House as follows. This resolution may be cited as the Emergency Powers No. 2 Continuance Resolution 2018. 2. The state of public emergency declared by the Governor-General by proclamation on the 18th day of March 2018 shall remain in force for 3 months until the 3rd day of July 2018. The Emergency Powers No. 2 Continuance Resolution 2018, which was laid on the table of the House on March 27, 2018, is hereby approved. Mr. Speaker, I beg to give further notice that at a later stage today, I will move for the suspension of standing orders to enable me to take this motion.
Questions and answers to questions.
Mr. Speaker, the time being 4:10, beyond the 3:15 period within which questions can be received or answered, I move for the suspension of standing orders to allow questions to be received and answers given at this time.
Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Science, Energy and Technology will answer question number 1 standing in his name.
Minister Wheatley. Mr. Robinson, you may see.
Mr. Speaker, I beg that the questions tabled in my name.
The Minister
the answer.
To answer your questions.
Yes. And could I just ask the Minister just to provide a copy so I can follow?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Question number 1. Would the Minister please confirm whether or not Symbiote Investments, which trades as Carousel, has been sold to a South African company, Involution Limited? Answer. I am unable to confirm whether Symbiote Investments Limited, Symbiote, has been sold to Involution Limited. However, I was advised by a letter dated August 17, 2017 from Symbiote's attorneys at law that the shareholders of Symbiote had, in principle, arrived at a decision to divest their interests in the company to Institution IX, a telecommunications company headquartered in South Africa. In addition, Symbiote, by letter dated October 4, 2017, requested approval pursuant to Section 17.2 of the Telecommunications Act to transfer control of its operations to Involution. Symbiote explained in that letter that the transfer would be way of a sale of a percentage of its issued share capital. Question number 2, if the answer is in the affirmative, would the Minister please state the terms and conditions of the sale? Answer, please see response to question 1. Question 3. Would the minister please provide an update on the status of the licenses that were awarded to Carousel? Specifically, would the minister indicate if Carousel has complied with all the conditions that were attached to the license? Answer. No telecommunications license or spectrum licenses were awarded to Carousel. Symbiote, however, is the holder of a domestic mobile spectrum license, a mobile carrier license, a mobile service provider license, a service provider license, international voice and data services, a carrier license, a service provider license, domestic voice services, and a service provider license, internet services. With respect to the domestic mobile spectrum license, Symbiote has not complied with all the conditions that were attached to the license. Question 4. Would the minister please indicate if the conditions imposed by Cabinet on the license awarded to Carousel will be continued? Answer. The conditions imposed by Cabinet with respect to the domestic mobile spectrum license in the name of Symbiote are a part of the terms and conditions on which the license was granted and subsist for the duration of the license. Question 5. Would the minister please confirm whether or not he has granted approval for the licenses awarded to Carousel to be transferred to Involution Limited as required by the Telecommunications Act? Answer. No, I have not granted approval for any of these licenses awarded to Symbiote to be transferred to Involution. Question number 6. Would the minister please indicate the due diligence conducted on Involution Limited and the government agencies which were involved in that exercise? Answer. The Office of Utilities Regulation has been asked by me to review Symbiote's requests for approval to transfer control of its operations to Involution and to provide its comments and or recommendations for my consideration. The OUR is still conducting its review.
Minister, thank you for the answers. Have you sought clarification from Symbiote as to the terms or the nature of the sale to institution IX? And I ask that within the context of concerns that were raised by our partners about some of the principals who were involved with Symbiote and subsequent action taken by those partners and also action taken by the government of Jamaica. So I would think it would be important for the government of Jamaica to know before proceeding whether the concerns that were raised about some of the principals, whether those principals are still included in the company, whether the company has been sold completely, partially. Have you sought that clarification from Symbiote?
Member, the minister is only responsible for or can only participate in such a sale or transaction when it relates to the necessary approvals that is required from the minister. And that is as relates to the license. The request was made for approval from the minister. None was given because there were no recommendations coming from the OUR as the Telecommunication Act stipulate, recommending to the minister to go ahead with such an approval or to give such an approval.
But even before referring to the OUR for due diligence, wouldn't it be prudent of the government to understand what the nature of the transaction is? Is, for example, 5% of the company being sold, 10%, a controlling interest, particularly given the history of this matter? And the history is that your administration took action to rescind some of the same licenses. So there were clearly concerns that not just existed from our external partners, but by the government of Jamaica itself. So even before referring it to external agencies to determine the due diligence of the proposed buyers, I would think you would want to know what the nature of that agreement is.
Member, I'm sure you're aware that it is the OUR that through its offices conducts the due diligence. Now, you will recall or see in my answer as it relates to the request, the letter that was sent to my office from Symbiote indicating that they are looking to transfer, that they will transfer a percentage of its issued share capital. And as such, for it to the meat of the matter is the transfer of the license. So a private transaction is outside of the remit of the government as it relates to any private transaction. However, when it comes to the license, it is now the responsibility of the government to ensure that the entities involved pass the necessary due diligence test.
Minister, I think your answer would apply under normal standard circumstances. But I think in this case, normal circumstances do exist. The Contractor General made an explicit recommendation not to proceed with an award of licenses. The government did nonetheless. One of our international partners raised concerns. Persons associated with the company had their visas revoked. The government of Jamaica, through its own agencies, took steps to revoke the licenses. So it means the government of Jamaica must have had concerns about the company itself. I would think if there is going to be any sale, the government of Jamaica would have a vested interest in knowing and understanding who the principals are and whether the principals who may have existed in the company before are still a part of it, etc. Even before you get to the due diligence, you have an obligation to satisfy yourself that you are comfortable with what is being proposed by the company. And I say that against the background of media reports from the company where it has indicated publicly that it has sold its operation to the South African company.
Member, the whole process of transfer or sale of a company, for it to take full effect, and full effect I mean the transfer of the license, that a fit and proper test must be done. And all the parties involved must pass that due diligence. It is the OUR that actually conducts the due diligence. And if I do not get a recommendation from the OUR supporting, and I appreciate the point you're making, but you have to understand that the law applies in all cases, and it is a process. And the process stipulates that I refer the matter to the OUR for them to do the necessary due diligence and report back to the minister, and based on that recommendation, I would either go forward or refuse. As it is, I have not given any approval for the transfer of the license from one entity to another.
Minister, the government of Jamaica through agencies had taken steps to revoke licenses that Symbiote had. The last bit of public information was that the company took out an injunction to prevent that. Can you indicate what the current status of those licenses are? Is Carousel operating as normal? Have the licenses been revoked? Has there been a stay? I'd like an update in that regard.
Member, let me just use the opportunity to inform you and the House that we have started the process of revocation of the license. I have written to the principals of Symbiote indicating that I am in receipt of a recommendation from the OUR, and as such, I am proceeding with the revocation.
So just to be clear then, so the recommendation from the OUR is that you revoke the license, and as minister, you are taking steps to do so.
Sure that you capture the essence of my statement earlier. Shut up.
Can I, Minister, in answer to question 3, you said that Symbiote had not complied with the conditions that were attached to the license. Can you indicate what those areas were of non-compliance? question 3 in your answer.
At one point, there was a matter of outstanding fees. I don't have all the conditions with me, but suffice to say, there were a number of conditions that they breached, and as such, the OUR recommended that we proceed to revoke the license.
Minister, can you indicate if Symbiote is still operating as normal as a telecoms company as of today?
I will have to ascertain that from the OUR if they are still operating. But the process of revocation, and I must go back to that, it's a process. I'm sure you're aware of that. And we have initiated a process, and the process is ongoing. But I can ascertain from the relevant authorities, the OUR and the SMA, and report back to you if they are still operating. But I had written to them indicating that I have started the process of revocation. So until the process is complete, I would assume, and I don't, as a matter of fact, let me not assume. Let me not assume.
Minister, wouldn't you agree that it would have been prudent for the government, given all the issues that existed around this particular company, to come to the Parliament with a statement and not have information being put out in the public domain, which has created, quite frankly, more confusion than clarity for the government just to indicate, as you are stating now, where we were. It has been, we were here late 2016, we knew action was taken. Nothing has been said publicly apart from a release from the company saying it has been sold, advertisements indicating that this new company has pretty much taken it over. So in the public domain, there is a view that the company has now been transferred to this. So I'm just saying it would have been prudent for the government, given all the issues, to come to the Parliament or publicly to just state where we were at. So we wouldn't have to almost be trying to pull information from the government.
Member, on more than one occasions, I have stated that I have not given any form of ministerial approval. Now, if an entity wishes to put out whatever information they wish, I cannot prevent them from doing so, whether it's fake news or otherwise. What I can say here is that we have not given any approval, and for the transfer of a license, you will need ministerial approval, and no such approval was given.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I would ask that the Minister of Tourism answer the question.
Go ahead, sorry.
Standing in my name. Could I get a copy of the answers, please? You know. Huh?
Mr. Bartlett. Come start here.
Mr. Speaker, in response to the questions from the opposition spokesman on tourism regarding the United Nations World Tourism Organization, Government of Jamaica, World Bank, and Interdevelopment Bank Global Conference on Jobs and Inclusive Growth, Partnership for Sustainable Tourism, I answer as follows. Could the Minister indicate of the over 1,000 overseas delegates promised for the UNWTO conference, how many actually physically attended? Response. At no time did the ministry promise over 1,000 delegates from overseas. There were, however, 1,452 delegates who attended the conference. 37%, or 536 of these, were overseas delegates. Could the minister state how many ministers attended the conference, not including ministers of government from Jamaica? Could the minister give a list of these names and the countries they represented? Well, there were scores of ministers who came, in fact, from many countries. I've listed them for the minister's benefit, but just to indicate that these ministers include prime ministers and the president of one country, and the names are listed, and a number of international VIPs, including 2 secretaries general, the Secretary General of the UNWTO and the Secretary General of the OAS, and also the Secretary General of the CTO, the CHTA, and a host of international organizations. 3, could the minister state the final cost of hosting the conference? Kindly provide a breakdown of this cost, including money spent on verges, the Elegant Corridor, and the Convention Center. Response. The amount budgeted for the conference was $160 million, inclusive of sponsorship of $30 million, with an additional amount of $20 million for media and communication, totaling $185 million. A breakdown of expenditure as follows. The conference logistics was $65 million, and that had a positive variance, in fact, of $132,000, so there's savings there. And then the venue and catering, which really was the big area, because we had catered for 800 delegates. We got 1,452. So we had a variance of 27 million from that as a result of this really increase, massive increase beyond oversubscription, which is a big positive for the conference. The total protocol arrangements also had a variance, a positive variance of $1 million, and the conference support had a positive variance of 140,000, and the media and communications also had a positive variance of 5 million. So, Mr. Speaker, the total, as indicated, went over what we had originally projected solely because the conference was such a huge success. On February 18, 2018, just to give an additional bit of information for the members' benefit, Cabinet approved via decision number 718 the environment of 20 million from funds earmarked for public awareness campaigns within the ministry to make up for the shortfall of the 90 million. Therefore, there is absolutely no expenditure outstanding with regards to the conference. Table below also, because the member asked questions relating to the convention center, expenditure on the convention center. The truth is that there's no additional expenditure that was made on the convention center solely for the conference. What we had was a budgeted amount of, I think, 287 million for the development of the convention center to enable it to be a fit and proper center for major conferences and global events such as that. And so the expenditures there were not in relation only to the conference, but in building out the facility to be truly fit for purpose and suitable for international engagements. The other items that he asked about in relation to the Elegant Corridor. The Elegant Corridor, Mr. Speaker, is an ongoing development activity in Montego Bay area, well known, and it had a budget, I think, of 152 million for the completion of it overall. It had nothing to do specifically with the conference. As you know, the Elegant Corridor is continuing as we speak to be enhanced. When you drive there now, you will see the furnishings being placed along the embankments and other areas. So just to give detail on that, we did specific things now in relation to the event, like wrapping of the trees along the 17 kilometers of the corridor, and that cost $412,000. And the erection of the new Welcome to Montego Bay sign, which is there now and you see it, not just Welcome to Montego Bay, Welcome to St. James. And also on the obverse side is Welcome to Trelawney. So that's a permanent feature there, and it costs $193,000 to do. And then the estimate of maintenance activities during the month of November, what we would call prep work, to ensure that the place really was looking spick and span as it really ended up, and that was $4 million. And the estimated cost of beautification carried out along the Elegant Corridor and under the Montego Bay Eastern Gateway, therefore, was a total, including all those that I have indicated, Mr. Speaker, of $24 million. May it please you, Mr. Speaker, these are the answers.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you, Mr. Minister. Mr. Minister, you said there were 536 overseas delegates. I understand that everybody had to register, whether they were presenters, media, otherwise. Could you just confirm for me if it is true that there were, in effect, 252 persons who were overseas delegates who attended, who were not present? That would be the net number who were not presenters or media, being that the presenters and media, their airplane fares, their hotels, everything was paid for them. I'm just talking those delegates that came. Could you just confirm if the figure is in fact 252?
We maintain it was 536, and they included not only delegates that were in for the specific conference, but delegates that were in for ancillary activities such as the Smart Destination Expo that we had, and also for the gastronomy prototype, which was held on the last day.
All right. Secondly, Mr. Minister, with due respect, I know you start by saying that at no time did the ministry promise over 1,000 delegates from overseas, and also that, but I just refer you to some press conferences you had early last year when you indicated that you expected 157 countries to attend, 157 countries, and gave the number of visitors. So I'm just wondering, at what stage did that change?
We never told you that all of them. We said 150 countries were invited, of course, and we...
No.
What we did at the press conferences was to give you a running order of registration. We recall that very clearly. And we were registering, and the registration was against everybody's expectation. The UNWTO, in fact, called us and says, my God, you're going to have a bigger conference than the General Assembly. So we were giving you a running order of those countries from which registration had been recorded by the UNWTO. And that registration totaled, in fact, in the end, 1,452, as I indicated.
The cost, you have here that the actual cost of this conference would have been 204 million, 205 million. The breakdown of expenditure, page 3. Am I? No, please. It says here the actual cost is $205 million, excluding external works done on verges, etc. No. I'm not certain if we're looking at the same thing, Minister. Top of page 3, breakdown of expenditure. You have budgeted costs, actual cost. At the bottom of actual cost, you have $204 million.
You know, that included the questions that you asked with regards to, yes, and that's when we explained the variance of the 19 million, and that we had permission for the environment of 20 to cover it. Yes.
All right, Mr. Minister, just as a matter of interest, first of all, you had indicated you expected to have a large turnout of ministers from across the world. Is it in fact that you only had one minister outside of the Caribbean?
You had a number of ministers who came. Some came for the different elements of the conference. Some came for the gastronomy event, which was done in Trelawney. Some came for the expo, and they came at different points in time, including from Africa and also from Spain and from the Southern Caribbean area.
Yeah, but I understand for your UNWTO conference that there was only one minister from outside the Caribbean?
Remember, the conference, this one was not a technical conference. This is a conference with many dimensions. And so we had international members, ministers, responding to various elements of it. And I'll tell you the outturn of it, which will surprise you. See, the interesting thing is that, in all fairness, Minister, you are asking questions third hand. Because even though you were invited, you never came, and nobody from the opposition even came to the largest tourism conference held in the world during 2017.
Just in closing, Mr. Minister, the conference logistics, that included things such as paying for rooms and transportation and airplane fares, etc., amongst other things?
Yes, but you will recall, look at the numbers, you will see that we actually had a positive variance of 132,000 on the area of logistics. So in fairness, what was budgeted for, we spent actually 132,000 less.
So in closing, Mr. Minister, I'm just saying that, is it not true that when we even have UNWTO executive conferences, and I was a member of the executive for 3-4 years, I was chairman, and the fact of the matter, Mr. Minister, when we as ministers attend them, we have to pay for our airplane fare, and we pay for our hotel rooms as well, even when we attend. However, at this conference, Minister, what we have found is that the government of Jamaica has spent in accumulation over $230 million between the top and the middle, not including the work that was done to upgrade the convention center. If you say that you had 500 delegates, if that is the case, it costs the people of Jamaica $500,000 to bring each delegate to Jamaica. If not, if it is, as I understand, 250 delegates, then it costs the people of Jamaica nearly $1 million to bring each delegate. Mr. Minister.
With respect, I don't know where that math came from, because even if you divided 200 million by 500 and something, it wouldn't be $200,000 per delegate. The fact is, however, that I think the confusion in your mind is in relation to conference logistics versus the key element of cost, which is here, which is the venue arrangements, catering, and audiovisuals. And all of that was resulting from this super number of delegates that came, well in excess of what we had anticipated. And that's really the cost, the element of the cost that is the highest. The fact is, however, that in addition to all of that, we had the largest number of speakers to a conference of its type in the world. 167 of the top speakers of the world. Some of the most qualified, and indeed we brought in the level of global leadership of tourism that has never been assembled anywhere in the world before. And the Secretary General himself said so at the conference, at a press conference. He said that when he walked in and he saw the turnout, he thought this was a second General Assembly. And I think that was a powerful statement for Jamaica. And just to close, Mr. Speaker, I have, for his benefit, had distributed a copy of the main outcome from the conference. That's the Montego Bay Declaration, which is now the statement that the UNWTO is using for informing itself of the next millennial goals for the United Nations. In addition to which, 3 items from the declaration will be legacy endowments for our region, one of which is the establishment of the first ever global center of tourism resilience and crisis management. And that will be established at the University of the West Indies, and we will announce it properly on the 23rd to the 22nd. And in addition, and you know, because you benefited from the work we did with the G20 arrangements and the T20. But for the first time, Jamaica is going to make the presentation on behalf of the UNWTO at the G20 summit in Argentina on the 16th and 17th. And we will be presenting on the establishment globally of the small and medium tourism enterprises, which in fact is a coinage from your own country, Jamaica, and a matter that has been taken up now to be a campaign position for the UNWTO this year, to drive the small and medium tourism enterprises as a key way of driving job creation and inclusiveness. And finally, the UNWTO has also put together a program for multi-destination tourism. And we were the ones who drove that. And this region will be the second region on earth that would have multi-destination arrangement. The first being the ASEAN countries, that is Thailand and Singapore and Malaysia and Cambodia and Vietnam. And what we have done by getting Cuba, Jamaica, Dominican Republic, and Mexico to sign multi-destination arrangements, we have become the second region on earth to have a confluence of tourism countries that are going to market together and create airlift arrangements within a single space. I won't give any more. When we speak in the budget. When we speak in the budget.
Mr. Speaker, of course, we want to commend the Minister of Tourism for that fulsome answer. But I hasten to remind all members that notwithstanding the beauty of the presentation, if it is not noted by the leader of government business prior, it will not be taken. But I thank you on this occasion, Minister, for making up for the lack of information in respect of notifying us as to what is coming.
Questions and answers to questions. Motions that may be made at the commencement of public business requiring notice. Motions relating to the sittings of the House. Motions for leave to introduce bills. Presentation of bills without leave of the House first obtained.
Mr. Speaker, I now move to introduce and have read a first time a bill shortly entitled the Fisheries Act 2018. It's okay. Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice of second reading of the bill.
Public business. I'm going to ask members to have a seat for this particular item. And I'm going to ask the Prime Minister to proceed. Item public business.
Mr. Speaker,
thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, members. Mr. Speaker, I now move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take the motion, notice of which I gave earlier.
Those in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I believe we have exhausted debate. Oh.
Mr. Bunting. Mr. Bunting.
I got up on my feet to ask a question, and the Speaker told me I should wait until this. But it was really, could have been dealt with if I had had indulgence then. But as you spoke to, in response to some of the other members' questions, it further raised my concern about the question I was going to ask you. In sitting either, in Cabinet or at the Security Council, and you're contemplating declaring, and let me use the generic term, some enhanced security measures. What determines whether you use the ZOSO? Because you were speaking of the need for some intermediate step between sort of normal powers under the JCF Act and a state of emergency. And I had come myself to the opinion that the Zones of Special Operations Act was that intermediate step. And the powers to declare a zone of special operation are sufficiently broad that, for example, the entire St. Catherine North could have been declared a zone of special operation. The entire St. James could have been declared a zone of special operation in the same geographic areas that were declared as states of emergency. And my own feeling is that in the concern you raised about not creating a negative global backlash because of, state of emergency has a very dramatic effect in the international community. within the Memorandum of Objects and Reasons of the Zones of Special Operations Act, it made exactly that point, that this was a way of giving enhanced powers to the security forces without creating the sort of potential backlash for tourism or other areas that are declaration of a state of emergency. And as you were reciting the statistics in terms of murders, etc., that caused, which we supported, the declaration of the state of emergency, it's the very same sort of statistics you were reciting, or you would recite, to justify the declaration of a ZOSO. So I have now become concerned that there doesn't seem to be a clear distinction, and maybe you can clarify for me. As we see now a sort of non-exceptional use of states of emergency, where it seems to be rolling from one police division to another, as the statistics justify, where do we establish that distinction between what would warrant a state of emergency, the declaration of a state of emergency, whether the declaration of a zone of special operation? And I say that particularly because I believe that the results in both cases of the reduced incidents of violent crime come primarily from the saturation policing or police and military patrolling that is consequent upon the declaration of either one. So that so long as you have the resources, the security, the resources in terms of security forces, personnel and equipment and etc., that it, to my mind, would have the same sort of short-term effect, whether you declare it a state of emergency or a zone of special operation. But in your earlier, not your statement today, but in your earlier statements about the longer-term objectives of the zone of special operation, then you would move from the primarily security-oriented operations to a longer-term social intervention type of operation, upgrading the community infrastructure, etc., etc. So I would appreciate if you would clarify the thinking that goes into drawing that distinction between the declaration of one versus the other, and if you would consider that perhaps in a transitional approach or a phased approach, that you might very well go from a state of emergency, which in a sense better reflects that overwhelmingly policing operation phase of the ZOSO, to a second phase when you might no longer extend a state of emergency, but transition perhaps to a zone of special operation phase. And if you would, comment on that, Prime Minister, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you, Member. I believe you have sufficiently answered your own question.
Mr. Prime Minister, please.
Prime Minister, Ms. Daly,
thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Mr.
Oh, thank you very much. Mr. Prime Minister, while I am not opposing state of emergency, especially in my constituency, I have some concerns. One, too long we have put Band-Aid over some very big sore in this country. And I believe the time has come that we really need to look at these communities in a very holistic way. I have a constituency that is of a certain profile, and I'm certain that there are very good people who are living in the community. There are also in the constituency young men and women who want to be good. In regard to this state of emergency, I'm wondering if there is going to be any committee set up that we can look seriously on how we can get the unattached youths more involved. Because just having the state of emergency, don't care how long it exists, and after that you will just leave them on their own. What will happen after that? This problem still remained. Mr. Prime Minister, I'm begging of you that we look at these communities, because the people there are dying for support and help. And on a long-term basis, this short-term thing that we say in our 6-week course and a 3-month course for persons, some of them who cannot even read, we need to seriously look at the root cause of crime and violence in order that we'll be able to arrest it in a proper way. Thank you.
A member from Central Manchester raised an interesting dichotomy between the two strategic approaches of the government, the state of emergency versus the zones of special operations. Mr. Speaker, it was always intended that the zones of special operations would not be a reflex response, that it would be well thought out, comprehensive, and that it would form part of a long-term response. We agonized over the use that there is no intention to abuse extraordinary powers. I think there is a greater acceptance of the long-term nature of zones of special operations. And I must emphasize that, Mr. Speaker, that it is really a peacekeeping, peace-building, is community building. That is what the zones are do. Yes, they are geographically limited areas. Yes, it does, in terms of controlling the area, similar things to a state of emergency. However, we stripped out of the zones, for example, the power of search, which is a critical part of a state of emergency. We stripped out of the zones, for example, the powers of detention. Yes, we can detain, but not as long, and it's a different process which is far more involved. And that reduced some of the powers. Search and detention. We can't search without a warrant, right? We can detain, but it's not, the powers of detention is not as extensive as it is in the zone. And there are other slight differences between the two tools, right? So, whilst I understood why the Parliament in the first instance would seek to restrict extraordinary powers within the context of a zone, I think that we will have to re-examine that. Now, the state of emergency is, by its nature, I hate to use the term reflexive, but that's what it is. You have an emergency and you need to respond right away, right? And unfortunately, I think this House will have to acknowledge that there are certain areas of Jamaica where crime and violence is beyond normal law enforcement. That's the reality. If you were to compare some communities in Jamaica versus communities in war-torn areas, the death rate there, the homicide rate, the murder rate, the killing rate would probably be similar. So we do have these communities whose level of crime and violence is elevated above normal. So we have to respond with extraordinary measures. The other difference, member, between the zones and the state of emergency is that when we design the zone as a means of getting the public support, but genuinely for the comprehensive nature of the intervention, is that built into it is the obligation on the government for social intervention. So as we declare a joint force, we declare a special intervention committee, which means government has to put resources behind it to deal with roads and other social and physical infrastructure. So those are the main difference. SOE is short-term, ZOSO is long-term. SOE has limited powers, state of emergency has the comprehensive suite of powers and meant to be short-term in nature. The other thing is the scale of deployment. So you can declare the entire Jamaica under a state of emergency, and from an operational perspective, the police would have the powers to operate anywhere in Jamaica or anywhere that it is declared using those powers. Under the zone, we cannot declare the entire Jamaica. And from an operational perspective, the area is usually very well defined and restricted to a community. So we couldn't, for example, declare a police area. We could, but from an operational perspective, it just wouldn't. Yes. Within the Act it does, but from an operational perspective. And so those are the differences, member. So there are two tools that we have. I think if we engage in some discussions, we could improve the zones to give it some of the powers so that we don't have to use the term state of emergency, which connotes all kinds of things in the international media. Member, I well understand what you're saying. In your constituency, you have part of a major gang which has created mayhem and havoc in the lives of many of your constituents, and indeed, they spread almost all over Jamaica. The issue there, yes, the state of emergency will give a little bit of respite for the community and the citizens. Yeah, but in the long term, the social intervention is necessary. And this is what I had said earlier, that we now must pay attention to the intention of the criminals. And when we say intention now, we are talking about the criminal mind thinking out the criminal enterprise and putting it into action. That is really focusing on the dons. The other part of it is the propensity. So yes, you're going to commit a crime, you're going to rob somebody, but in the course of the robbery, you end up killing three persons. The gruesomeness of the crime. Those are issues that we will have to have another discussion about the kinds of social interventions about violence. But I want to reassure you, member, that the government is serious about engaging the unattached youth, which you have mentioned. We have worked out the modality in which we can increase the government sponsorship of attachment. And this year, you will be seeing many more programs which will enable you as a member of parliament to help with engagement. But I think there has to be a kind of consensus within this parliament about the government seeking to expand national service programs, leader of the opposition. We have started one with the Jamaica Defense Force, but there are many other areas in which we can pull in our young people, and I believe that once we start the collaboration, we can jointly come up with ideas as to how we can engage more of the young people to keep them out of gangs and diverted to other activities which I believe would be more rewarding to them and safer for Jamaica. Mr. Speaker, I encourage the bill to the members.
We are going to have to do a call for the vote. Here, put through.
Do the formalities. Well, Mr. Speaker, I now ask that the motion be approved.
Okay, we're going to have a roll call for the motion, please.
It's a vote. It's a vote.
Mr. R. Scott, Mr. Azan, Mr. Bartlett, Mr. Bartlett, okay, Dr. Bloomfield, Mr. Brown, Mr. Brown, Dr. Brown-Burke, Mr. Buchanan, absent. Mr. Bunting, Dr. Campbell, Mr. Leslie Campbell, Dr. Chang, Mr. Chuck, Mr. Clark, Mr. Leroy Clark, Dr. Clark, Mrs. Cuthbert Flynn, Ms. Daly, Mr. Daly, Mrs. Dalrymple Philibert, Dr. Dunn, Dr. Dunn,
Members, you're not listening to your name.
Mr. Fagan,
Go ahead.
Mr. Fagan, he's answering. I haven't called him. Mr. Fagan is absent. Yeah. Okay, absent. Dr. Ferguson, Mr. Goulding, Mr. Bartlett, Ms. Grange, Mr. Green, Dr. Guy, Ms. Hannah, Mr. Hales, absent. Mr. Henry, Mr. Holness, Mrs. Holness, Mr. Hutchinson, Mr. Hilton, Mr. Hilton, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Kellier, Mrs. Malahoo Fort, Mr. Main, Mr. Mackenzie, Dr. McNeil, Mr. Montague, and present. Ms. Nita, Mr. Paulwell, Mr. Michael Phillips, Dr. Phillips, Mr. Pickersgill, Mr. Redmond, Mr. Robertson, Mr. Robertson, Mr. Robinson, Mrs. Robinson, Mr. Samuda, Mr. Shaw, Mr. Spencer, Mr. Stewart, Mr. Terry Long, Reverend Thwaites, Mr. Tufton, Mr. Darrell Vaz, Mr. Dwayne Vaz, Mr. Warmington, Dr. Wheatley, Mrs. Williams, Mr. Witter, Mr. Wright, Mr. Speaker. Aye. Said yes.
Members,
you know, all them treat was turn on my.
we have the results, the voting, but we are making sure.
14 persons absent. 14 persons absent and 49 votes. 49 ayes, no noes, no.
The results, 49 ayes, no noes, and 14 people absent. The vote is carried in favor.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, it is not intended to do any further business today, but in closing, let me say how appreciative I have been of the conduct in which this particular parliament was handled. I think if we could only just try our very best to win the arguments by the content and quality of our discussion rather than the sound, the decibels that we apply in trying to win ourselves, our argument. So, Mr. Speaker, the House will adjourn until April the 3rd at 2 p.m. April at 2 p.m.
The motion is that this House be now adjourned until the 3rd of April at 2 p.m. Those in favor? Those against? As have it. This Honourable House now stands adjourned. All members stand and stay in place.